He rescued a giant Apache woman, dragged half-frozen from the hands of drunken railroad men. But the moment he carried her into his lonely cabin, the whole frontier began to tremble. Because at dawn, her father arrived, not with vengeance, but with 200 warriors thundering down the ridge and a proposal no settler had ever faced before. The rancher must choose: honor the daughter he saved, or risk a war he cannot win. And just as the town's church bell rings, whispers spread false charges: stolen land, soldiers with shackles, and a railroad agent who will stop at nothing. What happens when mercy collides with hatred on the edge of the Rockies? Will this unlikely union heal a broken land door, tear it apart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Snow fell thick and heavy over Trinidad's Main Street, turning the rutted mud into treacherous slush. Luke Kavanaugh hunched his broad shoulders against the biting wind as he guided his mule toward the hitching rail outside Thompson's General Store. The beast's hooves made sucking sounds in the muck, and steam rose from its flanks in the cold afternoon air. Luke secured the mule with practiced movements, his leather gloves creaking as he tied the reins. The weight of his season's work, dozens of carefully prepared pelts hung across the mule's back in weathered canvas sacks. He'd spent months alone in his line shack, tracking and trapping, preparing the furs with the patience his father had taught him. The store's bell jangled as Luke pushed through the door. Warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit him like a wall, and he pulled off his snow-crusted hat. Old Thompson stood behind the counter, spectacles perched on his nose, sorting through a box of new merchandise. "Luke Kavanaugh." Thompson nodded. "Ain't seen you since fall." Luke set his bundles on the scarred wooden counter. "Got some pelts to trade." Thompson's experienced hands sorted through the furs, beaver, fox, and rabbit, testing the quality of Luke's work. "Fine job as always. What you needing in exchange?" "Lamp oil," Luke said quietly. "And flour. Winter's going to be long." While Thompson tallied the trade, raucous laughter erupted from the saloon across the street. Luke paid it no mind at first. The railroad graders were always rowdy when they came to town. But then he heard something that made him stiffen. Cruel jeering mixed with the sound of a woman's voice, deep but distinctly feminine, speaking words he couldn't understand. Thompson's face darkened as he wrapped Luke's flour in brown paper. "Them railroad men caught themselves an Apache woman. Been making sport of her all afternoon. Sheriff won't do nothing, too scared of crossing the railroad bosses." Luke moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could see a crowd gathered. Outside the saloon, in the center, tied to a hitching post, stood the tallest woman he'd ever seen. Even bound, she held herself with dignity, though her dark eyes flashed with anger and shame as the men circled her like coyotes, tugging at her clothes and mocking her height. Something twisted in Luke's gut. He'd seen too much of man's cruelty. In his 38 years, had tasted it himself when fever took his young wife and the town doctor refused to ride out to their homestead, claiming the weather was too poor. The memory of that helplessness rose like bile in his throat. "Much obliged," he muttered to Thompson, gathering his supplies. The shopkeeper called something after him, but Luke was already pushing through the door. Snow crunched under his boots. As he crossed the street, the crowd parted slightly at his approach. Most knew him by reputation as a man best left alone. Luke's fingers worked at the buckle of his gun belt. The heavy weight of the Colt dropped into his hand, and he carefully laid the belt aside on a barrel. "Ain't no fun in this," he said, his quiet voice carrying in the sudden hush. "Let her go." One of the graders, red-faced with whiskey, sneered. "Mind your own business, mountain man. This here's railroad business. Ain't no such thing as railroad business when it comes to treating folks like animals." Luke's hands curled. Into fists, the first man came at him swinging. Luke stepped inside the clumsy punch and dropped him with a short, sharp jab. The second rushed in low, trying to tackle Luke around the waist. Luke's knee came up hard, and the man sprawled in the mud. The rest of the crowd drew back. Luke pulled his hunting knife and cut through the ropes binding the woman. She rubbed her wrists, watching him with wary intensity. Up close, she was even. More striking tall as Luke himself, with strength evident in her bearing. "Name's Luke Kavanaugh," he said softly. "You'll freeze out here. I got a place up in the foothills." She studied him for a long moment before speaking in careful English. "I am Nietzsche." A bottle shattered against the hitching post beside them. Luke instinctively moved to shield her, feeling the solid warmth of her presence at his back. More curses and threats flew with the bottles, but none of the men dared come closer. Luke led her to his mule, conscious of the town's shocked stares. He helped her mount, noting how she settled easily despite her size, clearly no stranger to horses. He gathered his supplies and gun belt, then took the mule's reins in hand. They left Trinidad behind, climbing into the gathering dusk. The snow fell thicker now, but Luke knew these trails by heart. His line shack was a good 2 hours' ride up into the hills, tucked into a sheltered draw where the wind couldn't reach. Neither spoke during the journey. Luke found himself oddly comfortable with the silence, broken only by the mule's steady breathing and the soft crunch of snow. He'd grown used to quiet in the years since Sarah died, but this felt different. Not the empty quiet of loneliness, but something more like peace. The cabin emerged from the darkness, a solid structure of squared logs with a stone chimney that Luke had built himself. He led the mule to the lean-to stable, helping Nietzsche down before settling the beast for the night. Inside, Luke got a fire going in the hearth, while Nietzsche stood just inside the door, taking in the simple space, the narrow bed against one wall, the rough table and chairs, the shelves lined with preserved food and medical supplies. A worn Bible lay on the table, and his mother's cross hung above the mantel. "Sit," Luke said, gesturing to a chair. "I'll make some stew." He worked efficiently, adding dried meat and vegetables to the pot, settling it over the fire. The familiar routine helped ease the strangeness of having another person in his space. As warmth filled the cabin, he saw some of the tension leave. Nietzsche's shoulders. The lamp's gentle light played across her features as she accepted the bowl he offered. Her hands, he noticed, were strong but graceful, marked with the calluses of someone who worked with plants and leather. "Thank you," she said simply, but her dark eyes held volumes more. Luke nodded and sat with his own bowl. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but here in the lamplight, something new had begun, though neither yet knew quite what it might become. Dawn crept over the foothills, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Nietzsche stirred, at the sound of a mule's loud bray cutting through the morning quiet. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar surroundings, rough-hewn logs overhead, a dying fire in the hearth, and the rich scent of coffee drifting through the air. She sat up slowly, the blanket Luke had given her falling to her lap. The rancher himself stood at the iron stove, his broad back turned as he worked the coffee pot. Steam rose in thin wisps, catching the early light that filtered through the single window. Luke turned at her movement, nodding a quiet greeting. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up a tin cup. Nietzsche shook her head, touching the leather pouch that hung at her waist. "Key," she said carefully in English, one of the few words she knew well. She pulled dried leaves and roots from the pouch, holding them out to show him. Understanding crossed Luke's weathered features. He brought her a pot of hot water, watching with interest as she measured out her herbs with practiced movements. The familiar ritual helped settle her thoughts, bringing order to this strange morning. Outside, the mule brayed again, more insistently this time. Luke pulled on his coat. "Need to check on that beast," he said, keeping his words simple. Something's bothering him. Nietzsche rose, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. She followed Luke out to the lean-to stable, where the mule stood favoring its left front hoof. Luke knelt in the straw, lifting the animal's foot with gentle hands. "Stone bruise, looks like," he muttered, more to himself than to her. But Nietzsche understood the problem well enough. She returned to the cabin, coming back with her tea pouch. Kneeling beside Luke in the straw, she pulled out different leaves than before, crushing them between her palms to release their medicine. Luke watched as she packed the herbs around the mule's tender hoof, binding them in place with strips torn from her blanket. The animal's tense muscles gradually relaxed under her touch, and she hummed softly an old song her grandmother had taught her for healing. Back in the cabin, Nietzsche surveyed the simple space with new eyes. Sunlight revealed patches where winter wind crept through gaps in the logs. Without a word, she began gathering straw from the floor and mixing it with mud from near the water barrel. Luke paused in his morning tasks, watching as she expertly packed the mixture into the largest crack. "Much obliged," he said quietly when she finished. The words were unfamiliar to her, but his tone conveyed gratitude clearly enough. She nodded, pleased to repay some small part of his kindness. The day settled into a rhythm neither had expected. Luke brought in more firewood, while Nietzsche stirred the remains of last night's venison stew, adding herbs from her pouch that filled the cabin with rich, unfamiliar scents. She moved through the small space with natural grace, despite her unusual height. Her presence both unsettled Luke and drew him, like the first warm wind of spring stirring winter-still waters, as she worked. Nietzsche sang softly in Apache songs, of grinding corn, of rainfall, of horses running free. Luke found himself pausing often just to listen, though he couldn't understand the words. The music seemed to fill empty corners he hadn't even known were there. When evening drew near, they sat across from each other at Luke's rough table. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the savory scent of the stew Nietzsche had transformed with her herbs. Luke broke off a piece of cornbread, pushing the plate toward her. "How did they catch you?" he asked carefully, hoping the question wouldn't push too far. Nietzsche was quiet for a long moment, gathering her limited English. "I gather," she touched her herd pouch, then gestured toward the river valley below. "By water. Men come fast on horses." "Too many." Luke nodded, anger tightening his jaw at the thought of the railroad men's cruelty. "The Purgatoire River," he said, naming the waterway she'd indicated. "Good place for herbs, I reckon. Purgatoire," she repeated slowly, testing the word. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, warming her dark eyes. "Good. Plants there. Medicine plants." As darkness fell outside, Luke built up the fire one last time. Like the night before, he laid a blanket near the hearth for Nietzsche, while keeping to his narrow bed in the shadows. But tonight felt different, less awkward, as if they'd found a way to share the space without words. Luke stared up at the familiar rafters, listening to the wind's whistle through the newly patched walls. "Cabin feels less empty tonight," he said softly, speaking aloud for the first time in years. He wasn't sure if Nietzsche understood his words, but something in her quiet breathing told him she understood his meaning well enough. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the logs. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. Neither Luke nor Nietzsche knew what the dawn would bring, whether she would return to her people, whether he would retreat back into his solitude. But for now, the warm cabin held them both in a pocket of peace, wrapped in darkness and the promise of rest. The first hint came as a tremor through the floorboards. So faint, Luke thought he'd imagined it. Then it grew stronger, deep vibration that rattled the tin cups hanging by the stove. Luke's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness. Years of frontier life had taught him to read such signs. Many horses, moving fast, He rolled silently from his bed, grabbing his rifle from its pegs. The metal was cold against his palms as he moved to the window. Beyond the frost-covered glass, the eastern sky showed only the faintest line of gray. The rest was shadow and starlight, but the rumbling grew louder with each heartbeat. Nietzsche stirred by the hearth, sitting up with sudden alertness. Her eyes met Luke's across the cabin's darkness. She cocked her head, listening, then whispered something in Apache that held both recognition and concern. Luke eased the cabin door open, rifle ready but pointed down. The cold air bit through his wool shirt as he stepped onto the porch. At first, he saw only darkness and the ghostly shapes of snow-covered pines. Then movement caught his eyeshadows, detaching from shadows, forming into solid shapes that surrounded his cabin in a wide circle. Mounted warriors materialized from the pre-dawn gloom, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Luke counted. 20, then 40, then lost count as more emerged. Bows drawn taut, lances raised high, their weapons caught the starlight like teeth. His finger tensed on the rifle's trigger, though he knew it would do little good against such numbers. A figure pushed forward through the ring of warriors. Even in the dim light, this rider commanded attention. Broad-shouldered and tall, he sat, his horse with the ease of someone born to the saddle. Eagle feathers crowned his head, and strings of shells adorned his buckskin shirt. His face was weathered like the mountains themselves, lined with years of authority. Behind Luke, the cabin door burst open. Nietzsche ran past him, calling out in rapid Apache. Her voice held joy and respect, tinged with something like fear. At her words, the warriors lowered their weapons, though their eyes remained fixed on Luke. A man stepped forward from among the warriors, younger, dressed in a mixture of native and settler clothing. He spoke in careful English. "Chief Payan Sen, father of Nietzsche, wishes to speak with you." Luke's grip tightened on his rifle as he met the chief's steady gaze. The morning air crackled with tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. Nietzsche stood between them, her presence both bridge and barrier. Through the interpreter, Payan Sen's deep voice rolled across the snow. "Word has reached us of what happened in Trinidad. You defended my daughter's honor before all the town, using your fists against many men." Luke shifted uncomfortably. Any man worth his salt would have done the same. The interpreter conveyed his words, but Payan Sen shook his head. "No. Many men watched. Only you acted. You showed courage and righteousness." The chief's dark eyes seemed to weigh Luke's very soul. Such a man might be worthy to join our people. The first rays of sunrise speared through the trees, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. In that growing light, Payan Sen sat straighter in his saddle, his voice taking on formal weight. "I make you this offer. Take my daughter Nietzsche as wife, binding our peoples together in covenant. She will bring honor to your house, and you will become brother to the Apache." The interpreter's words struck Luke like physical blows. He stared at the chief, then at Nietzsche, who stood tall and still as a young pine. Her face revealed nothing, though her hands were clasped tightly at her waist. "And if I refuse?" Luke asked, his voice rough. Payan Sen's expression darkened. "To reject such an offer would shame my daughter and dishonor your own brave deed. The bridge you built by defending her would burn." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But this is no small thing I ask. You have until sundown to decide. We will camp here and await your answer." With that, the chief raised his hand. The warriors wheeled their horses away, moving with fluid grace through the trees. Within minutes, smoke rose from small fires just within sight of the cabin. Luke counted at least 200 men setting up camp, their presence both guard and threat. Luke lowered his rifle at last, his arms aching from tension. Naichi still stood in the snow, watching him with unreadable eyes. The morning light caught her face, revealing strength and uncertainty in equal measure. "I'm sorry," Luke said quietly. Though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for, she shook her head, touching her heart and then gesturing to the sky in what seemed like a prayer. Without a word, she walked past him into the cabin. The door closed softly behind her. Luke stood on the porch, watching the Apache camp settle in. The sun climbed higher, but brought no clarity to his thoughts. Marriage, to a woman he barely knew. From a world so different from his own, yet in the 2 days she'd spent in his cabin, she'd brought more life and warmth than he'd known since losing his wife years ago. He walked to the edge of the clearing, boots crunching in the snow. The warriors watched him without expression, but made no move to stop him. Finding a fallen log, Luke sat heavily. He pulled his mother's small wooden cross from inside his shirt, running his thumb over its worn surface. The day stretched on, heavy with prayer and doubt. Luke paced, sat, paced again. He watched Naichi move about the cabin, tending the fire and preparing food she took to her father's camp. Each time she passed, their eyes met briefly before sliding away, the weight of decision hanging between them. Around midday, Luke found himself speaking aloud, voice rough with disuse. "Lord, I ain't asked for much these past years. Been content with my solitude, or thought I was." He paused, watching an eagle circle overhead. "But this is bigger than just me. Show me the path you'd have me walk." The sun wheeled across the sky, painting shadows that crept ever longer across the snow. In a few hours, it would touch the western peaks. Then he would have to choose between duty and fear, between isolation and connection, between the known path and one he'd never imagined walking. The weight of 200 warriors' eyes pressed against him. Waiting, somewhere. In the Apache camp, a drum began to beat, slow and steady as a heartbeat. The sound echoed off the mountains, filling the winter air with possibility and warning. Inside the cabin, Luke's boots traced a familiar path across the wooden floorboards. 7 steps from window to door, turn, 7 steps back. The afternoon. Light slanted through dusty panes, painting copper stripes across the room. His stomach churned with every turn, mind racing over the choice before him. "They'll hate me for it," he muttered, more to himself than to Naichi. "Old town'll turn against me if I marry an Apache woman." At the table, Naichi's hands worked steady and sure, kneading a ball of dough with practiced movements. Flour dusted her fingers and the rough wooden surface. She looked up at his words, dark eyes following his restless pacing. "Father, not force," she said carefully, shaping the English words with determination. "Want peace." Want, she pressed her palms together, then spread them like a bridge. Want, join people, make strong. Luke paused by the window, watching the Apache camp through the glass. Smoke rose from their fires in thin gray columns against the winter sky. His mother's Bible lay open on the windowsill where he'd left it, pages ruffled by his searching. Words about entertaining angels unawares, about the stranger at the gate, caught his eye again. "Could be the Lord sent you here," he said softly. "Could be this is my test of faith." He turned to face Naichi. But marriage ain't something to rush into. It's sacred." Naichi nodded, wiping flour from her hands with quiet dignity. "Apache ways sacred too. Marriage, big medicine, strong promise." She touched her heart, then gestured to include the cabin, the land, the warriors outside. "Make peace here. Make new family." The sun crept lower, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and amber. Luke's pacing slowed, then stopped. He stood in the center of the cabin, shoulders straight, as if bearing up under a great weight. "I've been alone a long time," he admitted. Since Sarah died, thought that's what I wanted. But these past days, he looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes, the patched wall where Nietzsche had worked, the herbs she'd hung to dry, the fresh bread rising on the table. Place feels different with you here, feels alive again. Before Nietzsche could respond, a drum began to beat outside. The sun balanced on the western peaks, a red ball of fire sinking into night. The time of decision had come. Chief Payansane rode forward as Luke stepped out onto the porch. The old chief's face was grave in the fading light, his eagle feathers dark against the sunset sky. 200 warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a great circle around the cabin. The interpreter moved forward, ready to bridge the gap between worlds. Luke drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Nietzsche stood in the doorway behind him, her presence steady as a mountain. He felt the weight of every eye upon him as he spoke. If Nietzsche consents, he said, voice carrying clear in the evening air, I accept your offer of marriage. I'll treat her with honor and respect, and work to build peace between our peoples. The interpreter conveyed his words in Apache. A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. All eyes turned to Nietzsche. She stepped forward, head high, and spoke in her native tongue. Though Luke couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear in the way she held herself. In the quiet confidence of her nod, Chief Payansane raised his hands to the sky, calling out in a strong voice. Warriors dismounted, moving with swift purpose. Dry wood was gathered, a circle of stones laid. As darkness fell, a fire blazed up, casting dancing shadows on the snow. The ceremony began with prayer. The interpreter translated as an Apache elder, called upon the spirits of earth and sky to witness. Luke bowed his head, adding his own silent petition to the God of his fathers. The flames crackled and sparked, carrying both prayers heavenward. From a beaded bag, Payansane drew forth a necklace of turquoise stones, polished smooth as water. Each stone, the interpreter explained, represented a virtue: courage, honor, faithfulness, wisdom. The chief placed it around Nietzsche's neck with formal words of blessing. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the leather cord that held his mother's silver cross from around his neck. The firelight caught the worn surface, making it gleam. He held it out to Nietzsche. This was my mother's, he said softly. She wore it crossing the plains in a wagon train, through dust storms and fever. Said it reminded her that love's stronger than fear. Nietzsche took the cross with gentle hands, bowing her head as Luke settled the cord around her neck. The silver gleamed against her skin. Alongside the turquoise stones, two traditions joined. More prayers followed, spoken in both languages. Promises were made of loyalty, of respect, of building bridges between peoples. The warriors began to drum, a heartbeat. Rhythm that echoed off the mountainsides. Songs rose in ancient Apache melodies, voices carrying into the night sky. As the ceremony drew to a close, Luke and Nietzsche stood side by side before the fire. Chief Payansane placed their hands together, binding them with a strip of white buckskin. His deep voice rolled out over the gathering, speaking words of power and promise. He says, "You are now one family," the interpreter explained. As your hands are bound, so are your peoples bound in peace. The buckskin was untied, but something stronger remained, a covenant sealed under the rising moon. The warriors cheered, their voices thundering against the mountains. More drums joined the first, filling the night with rhythm and joy. Later, as the celebration continued outside, Luke and Nietzsche sat in the quiet of the cabin. The lamplight cast a gentle glow, softening the corners of the room. They were not yet lovers that would come with time and trust, but they were bound now in honor. Their lives woven together by choice and ceremony. Luke watched Nietzsche as she added wood to the fire. The turquoise stones caught the light as she moved, and his mother's cross rested at her throat. Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like a fist slowly opening. For the first time in years, Luke felt the urge to pray, not from duty, but from gratitude. He bowed his head, words coming soft but sure. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for sending me a sign. Help me be worthy of this trust. Help me build something true here, something that brings hope to both our peoples." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the drums played on, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat against the vast silence of the mountains. Through the window, stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to promises made and a new path chosen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-touched grass as Luke saddled his horse. Nietzsche emerged from the cabin wearing a clean buckskin dress, her new turquoise necklace and Luke's mother's cross catching the light. She moved with quiet grace, securing their trading goods on the pack mule. "Ready?" Luke asked, offering his hand to help her mount. Nietzsche swung easily into the saddle of the spare horse, her height making the movement fluid. "Ready," she echoed, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. They rode side by side down the mountain trail, hooves crunching on patches of lingering snow. Luke found himself stealing glances at his new wife, still marveling at how much had changed in just 2 days. The silence between them felt comfortable, like a shared breath. As they approached Trinidad, Luke's shoulders tensed. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through the crisp air. He could already see heads turning, people pausing in their morning routines to stare. "Hold your head high," he murmured, more to himself than to Nietzsche. They tied their horses at the hitching rail outside the mercantile. Whispers rippled through the street like wind through dry grass. A cluster of women outside the millinery drew back, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. 2 ranch hands stopped mid-conversation, tobacco juice forgotten in their cheeks. "Look at the size of her," someone muttered. "Like some kind of giant." "Kavanaugh's gone plumb crazy," another voice added. Taking up with an Apache, Luke's jaw tightened, but Nietzsche touched his arm lightly. Her dark eyes held calm strength, steadying him. Together, they climbed the wooden steps to the mercantiles. Porch. The store bell jangled as they entered. Old Mr. Peterson behind the counter dropped the tin cup he was polishing. It clattered against the wooden floor, rolling under a barrel of nails. His roomy eyes darted between Luke and Nietzsche, uncertainty plain on his weathered face. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," Luke said evenly. "Need flour and beans. Some seed corn too, if you've got it." The storekeeper nodded jerkily, finding his voice. Right here. Luke, just got a fresh shipment." As Peterson gathered their supplies, more customers drifted in. They lingered by the shelves, pretending to study goods while stealing glances at the unlikely pair. Nietzsche stood tall and dignified, examining a bolt of calico with genuine interest. The bell jangled again. Preacher Harlan entered, his thin frame wrapped in a worn black coat. His eyes brightened at the sight of them, and a trembling smile crossed his lined face. "Luke Kavanaugh," he said, stepping forward with extended hand. "I heard tell of your marriage. Been hoping to see you both." Luke clasped the offered hand, relief flooding through him at this simple gesture of acceptance. "Preacher, this here's Nietzsche." The old minister bowed slightly to Nietzsche. "Welcome, my dear. As Paul wrote to the Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female, for they are all one in Christ Jesus." Nietzsche inclined her head, understanding if not the words, then the kindness. Behind them, "Thank you," she said carefully. Several customers turned away at this exchange, shuffling toward the door. But the preacher stood his ground, speaking quietly to Luke about the weather and the spring planting to come. His ordinary conversation drew some of the sting from the others' rejection. After paying for their supplies, Luke and Naichi stepped back into the street. The sun had climbed higher, warming the wooden sidewalks. As they passed the smithy, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil paused. A group of children playing marbles stopped their game to stare at Naichi. Their eyes were wide, fixed on her towering height. One small boy clutched his marble pouch closer, as if afraid. Instead of hurrying past, Naichi knelt slowly in the dust. From a beaded pouch at her waist, she drew out a small wooden figure. Horse, expertly carved and polished smooth. With a gentle smile, she held it out to the nearest child. The little girl hesitated, looking up at her mother, who stood frozen in the smithy doorway. But curiosity won out. She stepped forward, accepting the toy with wondering fingers. "Pretty horse," Naichi said softly. The child's face lit up. "Thank you, ma'am." She turned to show the others, who crowded close to see. Their fear melted away as Naichi showed them how the horse's head was tilted, as if listening for danger. Luke watched the scene unfold, his heart warming. Trust, he realized, could grow from the smallest seeds of kindness. They completed their errands through the afternoon, gathering what they needed for the cabin. Some townsfolk still turned away, hurrying past with averted eyes. But others, perhaps, inspired by the preacher's example, offered cautious nods or brief greetings. As the sun began to sink, they loaded their supplies onto the pack mule. Luke helped Naichi mount, conscious of curious eyes still watching from windows and doorways. "Reckon that went better than I expected," he said quietly as they rode past the last buildings of town. Naichi's lips curved in a small smile. "After calm storms come," she replied, her voice holding ancient wisdom. "But we stand strong together." Luke nodded, understanding her meaning. The day's relative peace didn't mean their trials were over. But they had found allies the preacher's courage, the children's innocent acceptance, even the cautious greetings of a few townspeople. Small victories, but precious ones. Their horses picked up pace on the familiar trail home. The pack mule, trailing behind them, suddenly let out a loud, complaining bray that echoed off the hillside. Luke and Naichi looked at each other in surprise, and then something remarkable happened. They laughed. The sound of their shared mirth rang out across the valley, startling a pair of meadowlarks into flight. It was their first true laughter together, breaking the last of the day's tension like sunshine through clouds. Neither of them noticed the dark figure watching from the shadows of the saloon. Railroad foreman Jed Harker stood in the doorway, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. His face was hard as he watched them ride away, malice brewing in his narrowed eyes. But for now, Luke and Naichi rode homeward in the golden evening light, their laughter still echoing in the crisp mountain air. The pack mule brayed again, as if adding his own opinion to their joy. The sound followed them up the trail, a counterpoint to the steady rhythm of hoofbeats carrying them back to their cabin in the hills. The first heavy snows came in the night, blanketing the foothills in pristine white. Luke woke to find drifts piled against the cabin walls, the morning sun turning them to sparkled diamond. Inside, the fire had burned low, but Naichi was already up, stirring embers back to life with practiced hands. "Need more wood?" she said simply, reaching for her shawl. Luke pulled on his boots. "I'll get it." But Naichi was already at the door, her tall frame filling the doorway. "We get together," she said firmly. "Faster that way." Outside, their breath clouded in the crystal air. Luke marveled as Naichi lifted logs that would challenge most men, stacking them easily in her arms. Her strength matched his own, making the work go twice as quick. When he mentioned this, she smiled. "Apache women strong," she explained, hefting another load. "Must be, to survive." They fell into a rhythm as the days shortened and winter deepened. Mornings began with sharing coffee and cornbread before tending to the stock. Luke found comfort In watching Nietzsche move through the barn, her sure hands gentle with the animals. She had a way of humming softly that seemed to calm even the most nervous colt. The afternoon light would find them working side by side. Luke splitting wood while Nietzsche hauled water from the creek, both of them checking fence lines and watching. For Wolfsign, her knowledge of winter survival proved invaluable. She showed him how to pack snow around the cabin's foundation for better insulation, and which pine needles made the most soothing tea for coughs. In the evenings, as darkness gathered early, they would sit before the fire. Nietzsche began sharing stories of her people, her voice taking on a melodic quality that made even words Luke didn't understand feel meaningful. She taught him Apache phrases, patient with his clumsy pronunciation. "Enda," she said one night, pointing to herself. "Hope." "Enda," Luke repeated carefully. She nodded, then gestured to include them both. "Kea family." Her hands swept wider, encompassing the cabin. "Hugin home." Luke found himself sharing too, teaching her the hymns his mother had sung. "Come, thou fount of every blessing" became their favorite. Luke's deep voice humming the melody while Nietzsche joined in, her broken English growing more confident with each verse. "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it." They sang together as the fire crackled. Prone to leave the God I love, one crisp Sunday morning, they saddled up for the ride to town. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves as they made their way down the trail. Luke noticed Nietzsche sat straighter in her saddle as they approached the church. Her chin lifted against the stairs they both knew would come. The little white church stood stark against the winter sky, smoke rising from its pot-bellied stove. As they tied their horses, the congregation filed past. Some hurried by with averted eyes, while others stopped to openly gape at the sight of Luke Kavanaugh and his Apache wife attending service together. Inside, the warmth of the stove couldn't quite dispel the chill of whispered comments and sideways glances. Luke and Nietzsche took a pew near the back, but Preacher Harlan had other ideas. As the opening hymn ended, he gestured them forward. "Brothers and sisters," the old preacher's voice quavered but held firm. "Let us pray together for all God's children." Luke felt Nietzsche's hand slip into his as they walked to the front. They knelt at the rail, and Preacher Harlan placed weathered hands on both their heads. The congregation fell silent. Lord Harlan prayed, "We thank you for showing us that your love knows no boundaries of race or custom. Bless this union as a sign of your grace. Give us all hearts to see as you see, and courage to love as you love. Amen," came the scattered response, some voices stronger than others. As they rose, Luke felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had not realized how much he had needed this blessing, this acknowledgement before God and community. Nietzsche's eyes shone with unshed tears, but her face was peaceful. They rode home through gently falling snow. White flakes settled in Nietzsche's dark hair like stars, and Luke found himself studying her profile. The strangeness that had first struck him about her appearance had melted away, replaced by familiarity and deepening affection. He no longer saw a Apache woman when he looked at her, but simply Nietzsche, his wife, his partner, his friend. She caught him watching and smiled. "What you think about, husband, about how God works in mysterious ways?" he answered honestly, bringing two lonely people together across all manner of boundaries. Nietzsche nodded, understanding. "Two trees grow stronger, side by side," she said. "Weather storms better together, better together." The snow fell harder as they approached the cabin, but Luke's heart was warm. He helped Nietzsche dismount, though she hardly needed it, and they led the horses into the barn together. As they worked to rub down the animals and spread fresh hay, their movements were synchronized, comfortable, the routine of two people who had learned to trust each other completely. Later, as shadows lengthened across the snow, they sat close by the fire. Nietzsche added pine needles to their tea, filling the cabin with fresh scent. Luke taught her another verse of Come Thou Fount, and she shared more Apache words: peace, trust, beloved. The firelight caught the silver cross at Nietzsche's throat, Luke's mother's cross, given on their wedding night. She touched it gently, then reached for Luke's hand. No words were needed. They had found something precious, a home built not of logs and mud, but of shared faith, mutual respect, and growing love. Outside, the snow continued to fall. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Luke squeezed Nietzsche's hand, knowing that challenges lay ahead. The railroad men's anger would not sleep forever. But for now, in this moment, peace reigned in their small cabin, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. Evening shadows stretched long across the cabin floor as Luke and Nietzsche finished their simple supper. Steam rose from there, tin cups of coffee mingling with the lingering aroma of cornbread and beans. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting warm light on the rough-hewn walls. Luke watched as Nietzsche gathered the empty plates, her movements graceful despite her imposing height. She had just begun to heat water for washing when a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Both of them froze. Visitors were rare this far up in the foothills, especially after dark. Luke reached for his rifle, but Nietzsche touched his arm, shaking her head. He nodded, understanding her counsel for caution. "Who's there?" Luke called out, his deep voice steady. "Billy Mason from the Dixon spread," came the reply, breathless and urgent. "Please, Mr. Kavanaugh, I got news you need to hear." Luke recognized the voice of the young ranch hand. He opened the door to find Billy shivering in the cold, his horse lathered and steaming behind him. "Come in, boy," Luke said, stepping aside. "What brings you up here at this hour?" Billy stumbled in, removing his hat. His eyes darted nervously to Nietzsche, who quietly poured him a cup of coffee. The young man's hands shook as he took it. "It's that railroad foreman, Harker," Billy blurted out. "I was cleaning up at the saloon when I heard him talking with his men. He's sworn to run you off this land, Mr. Kavanaugh." Luke's jaw tightened. That's nothing new. Harker's been trying to push folks off their claims all along the proposed rail line. Billy shook his head. "This is different, sir," they're saying. "Your wife," he glanced apologetically at Nietzsche. "They're claiming she stole silver from the Graders' camp back before you two was married." Luke's fists clenched at his sides. "That's a damned lie." "Yes, sir, I know it is." But Harker's got some of the Graders to swear to it. He sent word to Fort Union. Soldiers are expected any day now. Nietzsche set down her cup with deliberate calm. "He want land," she said softly. "Use lies to take it." Luke saw the truth of it clearly. By accusing Nietzsche of theft, the railroad could discredit them both. A settler married to an Indian thief would find no support in territorial court. Their claim would be vulnerable. His anger rose like a tide, but Nietzsche moved to his side. She placed her hand over his clenched fist, her touch cool and steady. "Patience," she whispered in Apache. Then in English, anger clouds eyes. "We must see clear." Billy shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Harker's been buying drinks for anyone who'll testify against you, saying how no decent white man would marry an Apache unless he was in on the theft himself." Luke wanted to ride into town that very moment and confront Harker, but Nietzsche's hand remained on his, anchoring him. He took a deep breath. "Much obliged for the warning, Billy," he said finally. "You'd best head back before you're missed." After the ranch hand rode away, Luke and Nietzsche sat long into the night, planning. She reminded him of her father's words about peace being stronger than war. Luke knew she was right, but sleep came uneasily. Dawn broke gray and cold. Luke had just finished feeding the stock when Nietzsche called from the cabin door. "Smoke," she said, pointing to the horizon. Through the crystal morning air, a thin column of dust rose along the trail from town. Luke's heart hammered, but his hands were steady as he saddled his mule. Nietzsche disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with her medicine pouch and a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "You should hide in the hills," Luke told her. "I'll handle this." Nietzsche drew herself up to her full height. "We face together," she said firmly. "You teach me about your Jesus. He say truth make free, I stay." They stood side by side as the dust cloud drew closer, resolving into a column of mounted soldiers. Their uniforms were crisp, their rifles gleaming. At their head rode a captain, his shoulder bars catching the morning sun. The troops reined up in the yard, forming a loose half-circle around the cabin. Luke counted 12 men, all armed. The captain dismounted, adjusting his gloves as he approached. "Luke Kavanaugh?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "That's right." The captain pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "I have here sworn statements accusing your—" He paused, eyeing Nietzsche with poorly concealed distaste. "Your wife of stealing silver valued at more than $100 from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company's grading camp." "That's a false accusation," Luke said evenly. "We demand trial before a proper judge." The captain continued as if Luke hadn't spoken. "I am further authorized to arrest you for harboring a known criminal and conspiring to commit theft." "Aside from the woman? No." Luke's voice was quiet but firm. "This is my land and my home." "You have no right." "I have every right," the captain snapped. "These are legal documents signed by multiple witnesses. Now step aside, or my men will remove you." The soldiers shifted in their saddles, hands moving to weapons. Luke felt the tension coiling tight as a spring. Apache stood motionless beside him, her face serene despite the threat. Suddenly, movement caught Luke's eye. On the ridge above the cabin, silent figures appeared. Apache scouts, their faces painted for war, sat their ponies like statues. More warriors emerged from the trees, until the rim was lined with watching eyes. The captain saw them too. His face paled slightly as he counted the warriors. These were no reservation Indians, but free Chiricahua under Payan Sen, known for their fighting skill. "Captain," Luke said quietly, "I reckon you can see this situation could turn ugly fast. All we're asking is for a fair hearing before a judge. That's American law, ain't it?" The officer's jaw worked as he studied the ridge. Finally, he thrust the papers back into his saddlebag. "This isn't over, Kavanaugh," he said tightly. "We'll return with proper warrants. If you're smart, you'll clear out before then." He mounted up, and the soldiers wheeled their horses around. Luke and Nietzsche watched them ride away, dust settling in their wake. On the ridge, the Apache scouts melted back into the forest like shadows. When they were alone again, Key squeezed Luke's hand. "They come back," she said simply. Luke nodded. This is just the beginning of trouble. Inside the cabin, they began to prepare. Whatever came next, they would face it together, their bond stronger than any false accusation. But Luke knew the railroad men had played a clever hand. By using the law itself as a weapon, they had initiated a fight that couldn't be won with fists or rifles alone. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the chill air. From the ridge where the Apache scouts had appeared, a lone coyote called, its cry echoing across the foothills like a warning. The storm descended without warning, wrapping Luke's cabin in a white shroud. Snow piled against the walls until the windows showed nothing but crystalline darkness. Inside, the fire's glow pushed back against winter's siege, while Luke and Nietzsche fell into the quiet rhythms of waiting dot. Morning blended into evening as they worked side by side. Luke sat near the hearth, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he mended a split in his leather work gloves. Across from him, Nietzsche's fingers moved steadily, shelling dried corn into a wooden bowl. The kernels dropped with soft plinks that mingled with the fire's crackle. "Never seen snow this deep," Luke said, squinting at his stitching. "Even the mule's gone quiet in his liento." Nietzsche nodded, her eyes on her work. "Snow has voice," she said. "Tells us to be still. Listen." Luke watched her hands move through the corn, strong and sure. These days of confinement had drawn them closer, teaching them to read each other's silences. He found himself studying the proud line of her profile, the wisdom in her dark eyes. Dark eyes. "I ain't afraid of fighting," he said suddenly, the words spilling out. "Done plenty of that in my time. But these railroad men," he set down his gloves, frustrated. "They twist the law like a rope to hang honest folks with. That's what fears. Me losing you to their paper schemes and false witnesses." Nietzsche's hands stilled. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I too carry fear," she admitted softly. "My people walk narrow path. It's too much trouble from me and Luke. Soldiers come harder on them. Too much peace," she shook her head. "Railroad men. Take more land, break more promises." Luke stood and added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "Seems we bring danger to everyone we love." "No." Nietzsche's voice was firm. She rose and moved to his side, her height matching his. "Love brings strength. My father say this, when hearts join, spirits grow mighty." Together they knelt, and Luke found himself joining her prayer, their words mixing in English and Apache. The lamplight cast their shadows on the cabin wall. Figures bowed as one, for days passed before the storm released its grip. Luke saddled up early, determined to ride into Trinidad for news. The snow had drifted shoulder high in places, but his mule was sure-footed. Picking through the white wilderness, the town appeared unchanged at first glance, but Luke felt the undercurrent of tension. Men watched him from doorways. Women hurried past with averted eyes. Outside the mercantile, something caught his Aja posted notice, the paper still crisp. His stomach tightened as he read, "Wanted for THF T-Giant Apache woman known. Associate of Luke Kavanaugh Ward, offered for information." Luke ripped down the notice, his hands shaking with rage. Similar posters marked other buildings, spreading their poison through the town. He crumpled the paper and spurred his mule toward the telegraph office. Inside, old Pete, the operator, avoided his eyes. "Got some papers come for you, Luke," he said, reluctantly, pulling out a thick envelope. "Railroad business, I reckon." Luke's chest went cold as he read the documents. Legal language couldn't hide their meaning. Somehow Harker had filed claims on Luke's homestead, using forged deed transfers and false timestamps. The papers showed Luke's land being sold twice over before the railroad claimed ownership. "It's all lies," he growled. Pete nodded sadly. "Reckon so. But lies with official seals carry weight, son. That Harker's got friends in high places." The ride home seemed longer, the weight of the papers heavy in Luke's saddlebag. He found Nietzsche in the cabin, stirring a pot of beans over the fire. Without speaking, he spread the documents on the table. "See here," he said, pointing to the signatures. "This claims I sold the land 2 years ago, when I was still building the cabin. This one says I transferred it again last month, but the date's wrong. We were at church that day, remember?" Nietzsche studied the papers, her face grave. "Paper lies easier than tongue," she said. "But truth lives in land itself, in people who work it, love it." She moved to her medicine pouch, hanging by the door. From it, she drew a small bundle of herbs, wrapped in deerskin. "My father give these," she explained, crushing the dried leaves into a cup. "Say they bring courage when path is dark. Share." With me, steam rose as she poured hot water over the herbs. The cabin filled with a sharp, clean scent like pine and morning air. Luke accepted the cup, their fingers brushing. "Your father's a wise man," he said. "What else did he tell you?" Nietzsche sat beside him, her own cup warming her hands. "He say honor outlives flesh. When body returns to earth, truth of our choices remains like tracks in stone." Luke placed his hand over hers, feeling the strength in her fingers, the warmth of her skin. In that moment, the reality of his love for her struck him like summer lightning, sudden, illuminating, undeniable. This was no mere marriage of convenience or duty. Somewhere between rescue and resistance, his heart had found its home. Outside, wolves began their evening song, their voices rising wild and free above the snowy peaks. Luke and Nietzsche sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea, hands still. Joined, the fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Though danger gathered like storm clouds on their horizon, they had found something worth defending, not just land or honor, but the precious gift of two hearts, beating as one, through the cabin's window. The snow-covered mountains stood eternal, witnesses to their quiet defiance. The wolves called again, and this time their song seemed less lonely, as if celebrating the courage found in joining hands against the gathering dark. Dawn painted the snow-covered hills in shades of rose and gold. Luke stood at his cabin window, watching the first rays touch the crystalline landscape. Behind him, Nietzsche stirred the morning fire, the familiar sounds of their routine feeling precious after yesterday's discoveries. The thunder of hooves shattered the peace. "Cavalry," Luke said grimly, recognizing the disciplined rhythm. He moved to the door, deliberately leaving his gun belt hanging on its peg. "No matter what happens, we face it without violence." Nietzsche nodded, her face set with quiet determination. She stood tall beside him as riders emerged from the tree as 20 soldiers in blue uniforms, rifles ready, led by the captain from their previous visit. Behind them rode the railroad foreman, Harker, his thin smile gleaming with triumph. "Luke Kavanaugh," the captain called out, reining his horse to a halt. "By order of the territorial court, you're under arrest for conspiracy and harboring a known thief." He produced a paper with official seals. "The Apache woman is to be detained for deportation to San Carlos's reservation." Luke stepped forward, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. "These charges are false. We demand a fair trial to soldiers, dismounted, iron shackles clinking at their belts." They approached cautiously, then rushed forward when Luke made no move to resist. Rough hands seized his arms, twisting them behind his back. The cold bite of iron closed around his wrists. "No." Nietzsche's voice rang out as she surged forward, her strength catching the soldiers off guard. She sent one stumbling with a powerful shove, then grappled with another who tried to restrain her. Her eyes blazed with warrior spirit as she fought. "To reach Luke, take her down," Harker shouted. More soldiers swarmed forward, struggling to subdue her. Even outnumbered, Nietzsche's extraordinary strength kept them at bay until one struck her legs with a rifle butt. She stumbled, and they pounced, binding her hands with heavy rope. Luke strained against his shackles. "Leave her be. She's done nothing wrong." Movement on the ridge caught his attention. Silent figures on horseback watched the scene unfold. Snays. Scouts, their faces painted for war. Luke held his breath, knowing a single signal from them could bring 200 warriors down on the soldiers. But they remained still, honoring their chief's commitment to peace. The captain approached Nietzsche, who had ceased struggling but stood proud despite her bonds. "You'll be transported to San Carlos, where you belong. Maybe that will teach you to steal from white men." "She never stole anything," Luke growled. "This is all based on lies." "Save it for the judge," Harker sneered. He turned to the captain. "Get them to town before their Apache friends change their minds about staying peaceful." The soldiers forced Luke onto a horse, his shackles making it difficult to balance. Nietzsche they made walk, a rope connecting her bonds to a soldier's saddle. The morning air had turned bitter cold, but she showed no sign of discomfort as they began the long march to Trinidad. Luke's heart ached watching her trudge through the snow, head held high despite the indignity. Their eyes met briefly, exchanging silent promises of endurance. The scouts on the ridge followed at a distance, ghosting through the trees like shadows. Trinidad streets were quiet when they arrived, though faces appeared at windows to watch the procession. Luke was dragged from his horse and marched to the jail, his boots leaving dark prints in the snow. Inside, they threw him roughly into a cell, the iron door clanging shut with dread finality. Through the barred window, he watched them lead Nietzsche to the livery stable. "She frees in there," he shouted, but the jailer ignored his protests. Hours crawled by. Luke paced his cell, fingers tracing the small cross he wore, praying for guidance. As evening fell, he heard townsfolk gathering outside the jail, their whispers carrying through the thin walls. Could the Apache woman really be a thief? Seems strange. She's been peaceful all these months. Railroad men ain't known for honest dealing neither. But why would they lie? The murmurs continued until darkness fell. Luke sat on his narrow cot, body aching from the rough handling but spirit unbroken. Soft footsteps approached his cell, and he looked up to see Preacher Harlan's weathered face peering through the bars. "Brought you some bread," the preacher said quietly, passing a small bundle through the bars. "And something stronger than bread to sustain you." He held up his worn Bible. Luke moved closer to the bars. "Thank you, preacher. But what about Nietzsche? Have you seen her? She's being guarded in the stable. I tried to bring her a blanket, but they turned me away." Harlan's voice trembled with anger and shame. "This ain't right, Luke. Ain't Christian. Nor just." "Pray with me, preacher," Luke said. "I need wisdom more than bread right now. Right now." Harlan reached through the bars to grasp Luke's hand. "Remember Paul and Silas, son? Their chains couldn't bind the truth. God's justice moves in its own time, but it moves certain, sure." They bowed their heads together, the preacher's voice barely a whisper as he prayed for strength, wisdom, and deliverance. As they finished, a sound floated through the night air, a song in Apache, clear and strong despite the cold. Luke moved to his window, pressing close to the bars. Nietzsche's voice carried from the stable, the unfamiliar words somehow conveying both defiance and peace. Though he couldn't understand the lyrics, the melody spoke of endurance, of hope outlasting darkness. "She's singing about dawn," Harlan said softly. "Some of the words are like Spanishese singing that night is long, but morning always comes." Luke closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over him. His hands clasped together in fierce prayer, not for release or revenge, but for justice to pierce through the web of lies. The cross at his throat felt warm, reminding him that greater powers than railroad men moved in the world. Nietzsche's song continued, a thread of grace in the cold night. Other voices gradually joined in, first one, then another, until a dozen. Apache voices sang from the shadows around town. The scouts had crept closer, adding their strength to her song, reminding everyone that she was not alone. Luke sank to his knees, still gripping the bars. "Show us the way, Lord," he whispered. "Show us the path through this valley of darkness." The night deepened. Nietzsche's song faded to silence, but its echo remained in Luke's heart, a warm coal of hope against the bitter cold. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Their faith a bridge across the darkness that tried to divide them. Through his window, the stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unconcerned with human schemes. Like Nietzsche's song had promised, dawn would come again. Luke settled on his cot, hands still clasped in prayer, letting peace settle over him despite his chains. Truth, like love, could not be bound by iron. Dawn crept over Trinidad, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pearl and gold. The jail's iron door squealed as two deputies dragged Luke into the crisp morning air. His shackles clinked. With each step as they marched him toward the sheriff's office, where a small crowd had already gathered inside. Sheriff Morgan sat behind his desk, lines of worry etched deep in his weathered face. Railroad foreman Harker lounged against the wall, a self-satisfied smile playing at his lips as he watched Luke being pushed into a chair. "Got those transfer papers ready, Sheriff?" Harker asked, adjusting his vest. "Train to Fort Union leaves at noon. Want that Apache woman on it?" The sheriff slowly pulled out a stack of documents, his hands hesitating over each page. "Seems mighty rushed, Mr. Harker. Usual procedure is to hold a proper hearing. These orders come straight from territorial authority." Harker cut in, tapping the papers with one manicured finger. "Unless you're looking to lose your position over an Apache thief and her misguided protector." Luke strained against his bonds. "You manufactured those theft charges, Harker. This is about the railroad wanting my land, plain and simple." "Careful, Kavanaugh," Harker warned. "Your situation's bad enough without adding slander to your crimes." The sheriff dipped his pen in ink, his expression troubled. Through the window, Luke could see soldiers leading Nietzsche from the stable. Her head held high, despite the ropes binding her wrists. His heart clenched at the sight. Then a low rumble filled the air, like distant thunder. The sheriff's pen stopped, mid-stroke. From the east, a rhythmic drumming grew louder, accompanied by the sound of hundreds of hooves. "What in heaven's name?" Someone shouted from outside. Luke rose to his feet, the deputies too stunned to stop him. Through the window, he watched a cloud of dust rising over the town's edge. As it cleared, his breath caught in his throat. Chief Payan Sen rode at the head of 200 warriors, their horses moving in perfect formation. The chief's eagle feathers caught the morning light, his face painted with sacred symbols. Behind him, row after row of Apache warriors filled the street, their presence both magnificent and terrifying. "Sound the alarm," Harker shouted, his face gone pale. "Get those soldiers," but before anyone could move, something extraordinary happened. Chief Payan Sen raised his hand in a gesture of peace. One by one, the warriors dismounted. In complete silence, they began removing their weapons bows, rifles, Nivzand walking toward the churchyard. The town watched in stunned silence as 200 Apache warriors laid down their arms on the frozen ground before the church steps. They formed rows, standing tall and unarmed, their faces solemn. Chief Payan Sen strode forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "We come in peace," he announced in clear English, "to stand witness for truth." Preacher Harlan emerged from the church, his Bible clutched to his chest. The old man's voice shook but rang with conviction. "The house of God welcomes those who seek justice." Townsfolk began streaming from their homes and shops, forming a circle around the extraordinary scene. The soldiers who had been guarding Nietzsche shifted uncertainly. Looking to their captain for orders, Chief Payan Sen moved to stand before the sheriff's office. "My daughter Nietzsche is no thief," he declared. "She is a woman of honor, married in sacred covenant to Luke Kavanaugh, a man who has proven his worth to our people. These charges are false." Harker stepped forward, trying to maintain his authority. "Now see here, the railroad man speaks with forked tongue." Payan Sen continued, his voice growing stronger. "He seeks to steal land through paper lies. We have watched him pay men to swear false witness. We have seen him forge documents in the night." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several townsfolk nodded, their own suspicions confirmed. "Preacher." Harlan raised his Bible high. "Brothers and sisters, hear me. Christ teaches us that truth fears no light. These Apache warriors could have come with violence, but instead they stand before us in peace, asking only for justice." His voice cracked with emotion. "I say God's hand is in this morning's work. The preacher speaks true." Someone shouted. From the crowd, others joined in, their voices growing stronger. "We've all seen how peaceful Luke and Nietzsche have been. Railroad's been trying to grab every piece of land they can. Ain't right to separate man and wife without cause." The soldiers looked increasingly uncomfortable. Their captain approached Chief Pionsane, studying him with newfound respect. "You could have attacked with 200 warriors, but you chose this instead." Why? Pionsane's answer rang across the churchyard. "Because peace requires more courage than war. Because truth needs no weapons but itself." The sheriff stood in his doorway, transfer papers crumpled in his fist. "Captain," he called out, "I cannot in good conscience process these arrests. Not with such evidence of misconduct." Harker's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "This is insanity." "You can't let these savages careful with your next words," the captain interrupted coldly. "I'm beginning to think we've been misled about more than just today's orders." Luke felt the deputy's hands fall away from his shoulders. The sheriff himself came forward with keys, unlocking his shackles. "Go to your wife, Luke," he said quietly, "and accept my apologies for this morning's work." As the iron fell away, Luke rushed to where Nietzsche stood. Her bonds were being cut by the same soldiers who had bound her. When she was free, she rapped, her strong arms around Luke, holding him close as the crowd cheered. Preacher Harlan's voice rose above the celebration. "Let all witness how God's truth breaks chains and brings light to darkness." Let this day be remembered in Trinidad as proof that love and courage can bridge any divide. The Apache warriors remained in their silent rows, but their eyes shone with pride as Pionsane embraced his daughter and shook Luke's hand. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off the weapons laid down in peace, transforming the churchyard into holy ground where hatred had been overcome by something stronger. Around them, townsfolk pressed forward to welcome Luke and Nietzsche home, their earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of such powerful witness. The railroad foreman slunk away, his schemes undone by the very people he had sought to destroy. In his wake, new bonds were being forged between settler and Apache. Neighbor and stranger, all united by the courage they had witnessed this dawn. The morning sun cast long shadows across Trinidad's main street as Captain Reynolds shifted his weight, studying the gathered crowd with growing unease. The peaceful demonstration of Chief Pinsane's warriors had shaken his certainty. But military discipline demanded more than gestures. "Fine words about truth," the captain said, addressing both Luke and the chief. "But I need proof of these accusations against Foreman Harker. My orders came through proper channels." Luke straightened his shoulders, still feeling the bite of the iron shackles. "Sent someone to fetch Jimmy Porter from the telegraph office. He's got copies of every deed filing that's come through." The captain nodded to one of his men, who jogged toward the telegraph office. Harker's face twitched, but he maintained his composure, adjusting his vest with practiced nonchalance. "This is a waste of time," Harker declared. "Military orders supersede any local. Any local." "Let's hear what the boy has to say," Sheriff Morgan cut in, his earlier uncertainty hardening into determination. Jimmy Porter hurried up, clutching a leather satchel to his chest. The young telegraph clerk's face was flushed with excitement as he pulled out several yellow sheets. "Been keeping copies of everything unusual," Jimmy explained, spreading the papers on a barrel. "See here? 3 different deed transfers for the same piece of land, Meister Kavanaugh's land. Each one with different signatures, different dates, but all filed by the railroad office last month." The captain leaned in, comparing the documents. His weathered face darkened as he traced the signatures with one finger. "These can't all be legitimate. And there's more," Jimmy continued, gaining confidence. Got a whole stack of telegrams between Mr. Harker and the railroad office in Denver, talking about removing obstacles and securing the rights of way. By any means necessary. Harker's carefully maintained facade cracked. Those are private business communications, which you sent through my office, Jimmy replied firmly. I ain't bound to keep quiet about illegal dealings. The captain straightened, his hand moving to rest on his pistol grip. Foreman Harker, it appears we've been deliberately misled. My men were told we were apprehending dangerous criminals. Instead, it seems we've been used as tools in a land-grabbing scheme. Harker's eyes darted between the soldiers and the crowd. His hand shot toward his coat pocket. This is absurd. I represent the territorial. Before he could finish, his fingers closed around something in his pocket. Several townsmen, seeing the motion, launched themselves forward. Tom Wheeler from the livery stable and Big Mike from the smithy caught Harker before he could draw whatever weapon he'd been reaching for. They wrestled him to the ground as a derringer clattered across the wooden sidewalk, tempting to draw. On soldiers, the captain's voice was cold. Add that to fraud and false reporting to military authorities. Harker thrashed in the townsman's grip, his careful appearance now disheveled, his true nature exposed. You're all fools. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. I was just speeding up the inevitable. The railroad can come, Luke. Spoke up, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. But it'll come honest, paying fair prices for land, respecting both settler and Apache territory. Nietzsche stood tall beside him, her presence lending weight to his words. Sheriff Morgan stepped forward, keys jangling in his hands. Luke Kavanaugh Nietzsche, I hereby declare you free from all charges. He unlocked Luke's remaining shackle, then turned to Nietzsche. But Nietzsche was already working at her bonds. With one powerful motion, she snapped the iron chain, causing gasps. From the crowd, calmly, she gathered the broken shackles and handed them to the astonished sheriff. Chains belong to lies, she declared in clear English, her dignity unmarred by the morning's humiliation. Truth makes free. A moment of stunned silence fell over the gathering. Then someone cheered. Others joined in, the sound swelling until it echoed off the false-fronted buildings of Trinidad's main street. Even some of the soldiers were nodding in approval. Chief Pionsain raised his hand, and his warriors began moving with deliberate calm toward their weapons. The soldiers tensed, but the Apache men simply retrieved their bows and rifles with quiet dignity, returning to their horses without any show of aggression. The captain posted guards over Harker, who had subsided into sullen silence. He'll face charges in Denver, the officer announced. And I'll personally ensure that all land claims are thoroughly investigated. Townspeople began pressing forward, many approaching Luke and Nietzsche for the first time since their marriage. Sarah Miller from the Mercantile offered her hand to Nietzsche. I reckon we owe you an apology, she said softly. Both of you. Ain't right how folks have been acting. Others followed her lead. Old Jim Tucker removed his hat, speaking gruffly about how he'd seen Nietzsche helping children gather eggs behind the feed store. Martha Wilson recalled how Luke and Nietzsche had helped repair her fence after a storm, refusing payment. One by one, the barriers of prejudice began to crack. Preacher Harlan made his way through the crowd, his Bible still clutched to his chest. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he raised his hands for silence. Friends, he called out, his voice trembling with emotion. We have witnessed something profound this day. The good book tells us that mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. He turned slowly, addressing both townspeople and Apache warriors. Here, in our humble Trinidad, we have seen this holy promise fulfilled. Truth has prevailed without bloodshed. Mercy has overcome hatred. God's hand has turned conflict into reconciliation. Luke felt Nietzsche's strong fingers intertwine with his own. Looking down, he saw tears in her eyes, though she stood straight and proud. Around them, the morning continued to unfold with a sense of revelation. Apache warriors and settlers regarded each other with new understanding. Children darted between horses and adults, their natural acceptance of all people a lesson to their elders. The sheriff organized men to take Harker to the jail, while the captain gathered his soldiers preparing to depart. Chief Piansene spoke quietly with his warriors, many of whom were already mounted. Their weapons secured for the ride home, stars pierced the velvet darkness as Luke and Nietzsche guided their horses along the snowy trail home. The day's events had left them weary but peaceful, their shoulders touching as they rode side by side. Their cabin emerged from the darkness, half buried in white drifts, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire. Inside, they found the storm had taken its toll. Cold wind whistled through new gaps in the roof, and snow had drifted beneath the door. Without words, they fell into the rhythm of Repair Nietzsche hauling fresh straw for patching while Luke climbed onto the roof with boards and nails. Together, they cleared the damaged fence line, their breath frosting in the evening air as they worked. Chief Piansene arrived just before sunset with 4 warriors. He dismounted slowly, his face solemn but pleased as he observed their shared labor. In Apache, then English, he blessed their union with ancient words of honor. "Peace is like ice on river," he told Luke, gesturing toward the frozen purgatora below. "Strong enough to cross, if feet step gentle." Luke met his father-in-law's eyes. "I will honor Nietzsche always," he promised. As wife, as partner in all things. After the chief rode away, Luke and Nietzsche sat before their restored fire. The flames painted shadows across their faces as Luke finally found the courage to speak his heart. "I love you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Nietzsche's smile was soft as summer rain. She reached for the silver cross she'd kept safe, gently placing it back around his neck. Then she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his and their first true kiss, not a seal of treaty or duty, but of love freely chosen. Spring crept across the foothills, turning brown to emerald. In the meadow beside the cabin, the old mule lifted his head and brayed, watching Luke and Nietzsche work side by side. Their fingers met in the warm soil as they planted corn seeds in neat rows. The first visitor arrived with a basket of potato eyes for planting. Another came seeking Nietzsche's herbs for a fever. Soon, more townsfolk found their way up the mountain trail. Children squealed with delight as Nietzsche hoisted them onto her broad shoulders, their fear forgotten in play. One crisp Sunday morning, Preacher Harlan's wagon rattled up to the cabin. Inside, voices lifted in prayer and song, Apache and settler alike. Luke knelt beside his wife, throat tight with emotion as amazing grace filled their home. The cabin that once knew only silence now echoed with fellowship. In Trinidad, old prejudices died slowly, but kindness grew stronger each day. The sheriff, who once looked away, now touched his hat respectfully when Luke and Nietzsche passed. Their marriage had become more than unionette, was proof that peace could take root and flourish. Summer painted the valley in shades of gold and green. As dawn's first light spilled over the mountains, Luke and Nietzsche sat together on the cabin's rough-hewn bench. Her nimble fingers wove corn husks into tight braids while he drew a whetstone along the plow blade's edge with steady strokes. "Our children will know both peoples," Nietzsche said softly, her English growing stronger each day. Luke nodded, sharing. Dreams of apple trees taking root and a church bell's clear song echoing through the valley. Chief Piansene appeared like a shadow at daybreak, leading a small band of warriors bearing fresh venison. Soon after, wagon wheels creaked up the trail as settler families arrived with berry pies and cotton sacks of seed. The yard filled with the mingled sounds of Apache and English, laughter rising as all shared food together when evening draped. The mountains in purple. Luke lit the brass lantern and set it in the window. Its warm glow reached far into the darkness, a beacon of hope. "Our home shows better way," Nietzsche said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Together, we are stronger than war." The ancient mountains stood silent, witnesses to their lasting peace. Thank you for watching. This one reached you. Consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.